So I would say if you're not thrust into the situation and you're not forced, like you said, to put food on the table, start small and practice with the little things until you gain confidence that you can be the same person. You can do well at your job. You can do well in life, and you can start to move the goalpost, rather the kind of the identity signpost of who you are, and bump that out a little bit. And you can proactively push that with your actions. You do something, and then your identity catches up. It's not the opposite. It's not you decide to be a new person, and then you do stuff. You don't say, "I'm going to be an entrepreneur," and then you are. You do entrepreneurial things, and then your conception of who you are catches up with what you've done. That's how the brain works. I think on some level, I know that you can't really be criticized for doing your best in a bad situation. And it used to be, I don't want to be criticized. And now I've just seen the sort of inherent rightness of that behavior, of transparency and leading with, I'm feeling this. Here's what I'm noticing. Here's what we need. And here's what we plan to do in these situations. Do you have any questions? Just initially it was, that's the most defensible thing I can do. And then it became, well, it goes way beyond being, defensible, hard to criticize action. That's just a good way of leadership. And eventually I realized that good leadership is also in itself very, very difficult to criticize because it feels so good to be the recipient of.
Are you ready to learn how to grow your entrepreneurial mindset so that you can not just survive, but thrive now and into the future? This is your show. Welcome to PossibLaw. Let's get into it. Alex Boyd, welcome to PossibLaw. I'm super excited to have our conversation today.
Me too. Thanks so much, Sal. It's good to be here.
I have followed you on, the socials over the last couple of years, and we have mutual acquaintances, and I'm fascinated with this world of entrepreneurship. I'm an entrepreneur, but also just the mindset that comes from it. And so that's the whole point of PossibLaw, is helping people. I was a lawyer, sort of still am, and a lot of my audience is in the legal industry, and we're not super great about the whole entrepreneurial mindset. And so I'm trying to help people learn that, and that's why I love people, bring people on like you to have that conversation. But before I really get into the business stuff, I always like my audience to get to know you, the person, a little bit more beyond the professional. And so I always start with, what do you like to do in your free time? Do you have kids? What is it that you do beyond the Alex Boyd, the professional?
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. So right now I'm sitting in our little office in Portland, Oregon. Been here about 10 years. I was in San Francisco, born there. My family's still there. Grew up with my first generation grandma, immigrant from France. So got kind of a little cross-cultural background. I try to teach my wife a French word once a week, and no kids yet. Hopefully this year, next year. Well, I guess it has to be next year, minimum. And then one cat who we're obsessed with. Try to play music when I can. I'd say most of my time spent not at the office, which I genuinely love being because I'm excited about my work and I love what I do each day, is probably like gym fitness time recently. I have way too many peptides and supplements that I take constantly, and I'm trying to get my powerlifting total up to 1,000 pounds with no belts. I don't know if you see the video on this recording, but the Whoop is now giving me my speed of aging, and I might return the Whoop, but I am definitely on the doing the DEXA scans, watching my body fat, finding the organic options for the yogurt that I usually have. Anyway, all that stuff. So that's probably my newest obsession recently. They've rotated in the past, but it's kind of reaching a fever pitch lately. So that's the main thing I've been doing outside of work. And my wife used to be more like that, and then now isn't, and we kind of traded places. So she was super fitnessy, and now she is working on her business more, and I'm business has become easier for me, so I'm trading into fitnessy. So we're just kind of dancing in that way.
Yeah, as I've gotten older, I've learned I need to focus on things that I didn't focus on when I was younger, right? Like my health, getting to the gym, sleeping better, which is also why I have an Apple Watch, I have an Aura ring, I have, all the things. And I'm very lucky. My wife, she's a senior executive in advertising, but she's also a phenomenal chef, and she loves doing it. And so I have that benefit at home where it's lots of, all the organic things. And I kid around because I used to be like, why am I eating this again today? And now I just put the food in my mouth, and I'm thankful for whatever I have. And
yes,
but it makes such a huge difference. It is something that I think people forget, especially when you love working. I do too. I like what I do. And so it's not necessarily the classic, work-life balance, because I've never
Yeah.
really understood that. Like I enjoy my job, so like I'm going to do it when I do it, right? But making sure I don't just do that has been an important add-on in my life. So I love to hear that. I
Very cool.
also just generally, my daughter, who's 5, almost 5, we have a dog at home, a 65-pound Bernedoodle, who we
Cool.
also adore. But she every day asks for a cat. She's obsessed with cats, and I'm not sure Javi, who's my dog, will actually get along with a cat. So I've sort of told her no. But anybody
Yeah.
that's got a cat, if you ever see her, she will love you for that simple reason alone. So
Well, my cat stayed out late last night. Normally he comes back right around 5 or 6 and we call his name. Last night he stayed out till 10 p.m. So I didn't sleep very well and my Whoop recovery score was lower. So I'm a little mad at my cat right now. I'm just putting that aside for the moment.
yeah,
But
that's a new level of metric, right? Where you like wake up and you're like, "Oh, what's my readiness score and what's my sleep score and
yeah,
and then you're like, "Well, how do I fix it?" And Aura
right.
also has, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit of AI and technology, but Aura
Yeah.
also has like an AI assist, which is actually really cool because you can ask all
Mhm.
kinds of really interesting questions. It's hard for me as a non-medical professional to know how much of it is being totally made up by the AI,
Totally. Yeah.
but still interesting to see. I love that. One thing you said there, I like to dive more into with anybody I have on my show is this idea of immigrants and
Mm.
being raised by immigrants. And do you have a different perspective? I've noticed that, you know, either it's because a lot of times people emigrated with almost nothing. And so you grew up in that household with not a lot. And so you learn some of that grit. Or even if your parents were successful immigrants and they were great, they still had that like entrepreneurial wish to like go try, and that got like ingrained in you somehow. And
Mm.
I'm curious if you've thought about that at all in your own journey, if that mentality, if being a product of immigrants has impacted you in any way.
Yeah, I'd say so. It's funny you say that because my dad is not an immigrant and has been a lawyer for decades. And the one piece of advice he gave me was don't go to law school. My grandma is the one who I grew up with, who was like kind of a second mom and is like came to the US after World War II and she wasn't an entrepreneur herself, but she like did a bunch of stuff, like figured it out. She has that spirit, you know? And I'm much more channeling her, whereas I maybe used to channel my dad at first when I was first getting into the workforce. I was just like, how can I get a conservative, high paying job? And then now I'm just like, wow, that's so linear, you know? And there's nothing wrong with that. I just changed as a person. And so I do think that now I'm kind of embodying that spirit of, I guess my tolerance for certain types of risk has gone up. And I like to think about my tolerance for ruinous risk being as close to zero as I can, you know? But my tolerance for like day to day other types of risk and stuff like losing a client, losing a, like in the way that people would be just devastated to lose a job. Um, I'm not running a professional service company anymore, but if I lost a client, it used to be devastating. And then it would be like, okay, like this happens. Sometimes things run their course and you just kind of get inured to this day-to-day risk. So there's an anti-fragility of immigrants, I think, and that spirit that entrepreneurs have to have. Otherwise you just die mentally from all the little strains and cracks that happen. I mean, especially yeah, especially in professional services where, one client can represent a huge amount of your livelihood. Less so in products where, if one customer out of hundreds leaves, like, okay, we need to pay attention to this, but I'm also not feeling that on the P&L much. So yeah, I think there's a lot to that. And especially potent because of, like I said, my dad being such a, like by the book person and encouraged me not to start a company and was like very saying, don't do this a long time ago. So that was fun. But now I see where he was coming from.
Yeah, it's interesting. My father is Mexican. My mom's American. I lived in Mexico until I was almost 5, and then we moved here. Better opportunities, all the same
Yeah.
things. And even though they took kind of this big risk to come here, even though they were more settled, all those kinds of things, they actually kind of pushed all like us kids into your dad's version of the world, like very
Mhm.
like, no, just go to school, get as good of a job as you can get that thing. And I always had this thing in the back of my head, like that maybe didn't work for me, but I didn't know enough, right? Like I hadn't been exposed to, entrepreneurship or any of those kinds of things. I remember being in law school and being in like, I was on the board of the Latino Law Student Association, and we were talking about something. And I said something, everybody was like, why are you here? Right? Like, why did you go to business school? And it was like the first time I really was like, huh, that's a good question. I don't really know. But,
Yeah.
you get into that mode. And then I did the law thing, and not surprisingly, got really burnt out and really didn't like it.
Mm.
And as I got older, right, I'm kind of a new entrepreneur. I've only been at this for about 6 years, and I've realized how much I love it. And it is something that I think you touched on is you don't always know it right away. Maybe you kind of do, but you change who you are, or circumstances change, or whatever it might be. But one of the things I like to talk about is how do you hone the mindset of willingness to experiment and fail, which from my perspective is really that test of risk. A lot of people aren't willing to risk almost anything.
Hmm.
And when I talk about entrepreneurship, I don't necessarily mean start your own business. I just simply mean that iterative factor that is part of being a founder and entrepreneur is like trying new things and understanding a lot of it's going to fail, and that's okay.
Yeah.
How did you grow into that? How did you hone that skill?
That's a good question. It's funny. I have a friend who is a paralegal and went to law school, has hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, and never passed the bar. And I think she hates it so much that she's like refusing to, she's self sabotaging essentially so that she stays in this position. And, we often think about like, what coin would we drop in the top of that Plinko machine where it came out the bottom with like you changing your mind? And it doesn't work like that. For me, it was I didn't decide to, I just had to. When I left my last job, I was going to go into business with someone else as a partner, kind of got abandoned, and by the nature of non-compete agreements back then, which now would be either blue line to oblivion or unenforceable, I ended up having a giant settlement agreement that I had to pay off. And so I needed to change my mind to match reality. I didn't sit around and think I should become more entrepreneurial and more risk taking. I just thought this is a giant bill to pay. How am I going to pay it? It wasn't conscious like that. So when I'm working with people or like you know I'm an investor in other businesses too, and so sometimes I like kind of consciously think about how do I work on this person's risk tolerance. I mean, sometimes we do things like playing out worst case scenario more than you usually would, right? Sometimes I'll do this with one of my attorneys or a CPA, and they'll say like, sometimes they'll be like, "That's not a good idea," and I'll say, just out of curiosity, like, what would actually happen if we did that? I'm not saying I want to do this, but like, what would happen? And they'll be like, "Well, you just can't." I'll be like, no, no, no. I want to know. And they'll actually start to think about it and be like, well, I guess they would have to send this, and then you could push back with that, and then I don't know. And I'm like, okay, so we could wait 3 months or something. There's something where it's like, if you actually play out the worst case scenario, you have more leeway than you thought you would, versus just saying like that's out of bounds. I won't think about it. So having somebody prompt you, I think, to think a little further than you would. The answer might still be no, but it's usually a more thoughtful no, or it's like a qualified no, or it's in something else where you can kind of think more calmly and with more grounding about the edges of risk. And I think that gives you a better tolerance for risk, ability to do certain things. And sometimes it becomes a yes. It becomes, I didn't think about that. Actually, it wouldn't be feasible at all for them to come back and pursue you for this or whatever. And even if they did, you'd have warning or something like that, where, these are a few like kind of redacted hypotheticals of stuff that I've brought up. But sometimes it's like, yeah, actually, you could ignore this for the next month or something. So I found that playing out of those situations and being able to sit with it and not freak out, where a lot of like clients and lawyers, I feel like, will sit with the possibility of going outside that bound, and they'll sort of mentally freak out, and some level like, that's forbidden. You can't do that, And maybe the immigrant entrepreneurs in us and some of the, the good CPAs will sit with that and say, well, I don't think that's a good idea, but like you could. Here's what would probably happen. You wouldn't like it very much, but here's what would happen. And they can at least talk through it without like mentally going to a place of, oh my God, the world's falling down. And that's kind of what makes entrepreneurs possible, is because we live in imperfect worlds. If you're an entrepreneur, you have to be comfortable with imperfection. And the law and the tax code is not exactly a place of imperfection. And yet it's where we live. So there's a paradox there that you have to live with and deal with that tension internally. And that's what I think we need to try to do.
I love how you talk about that as a tension internally that you have to reconcile and work with, because I do believe anybody is capable of finding their version of entrepreneurial mindset, right? Being iterative in their job. They might have a standard W-2 professional job for their whole life, but can be very entrepreneurial in how they do things. It is really about an internal reasoning focus to do something. But I think it's also something that I know in the legal industry for sure is something you got out there, which is this tendency to assume right away that because somebody else had said it before, that that must be the way it is, versus first principles of just asking like why. One of the you can, whether you like Elon Musk or hate him or politics, put all that aside, his whole like algorithm idea, one of the very first pieces of it is just like, who said that? Not like what person said that, and then ask them, why is that here, right? And a lot of times you get exactly what you said, which is like, actually, I don't know. I did it because somebody else did it. And part of the reason I bring that up is that I also think when you do that is where you end up finding really cool new ideas in either a process or a company, in whatever you might do. And so just being willing to take that first piece of just ask why that specification exists or that law exists or that process exists is really important. And I love that you then framed that as a connection of like an internal tension that you have to use to move forward. My view on all this and my point here is a little bit like, how, if you have that tension, do you start with a first little small thing to jump? Do you just dive in? Obviously for you and others, it's just like if I want food on the table, I got to go do it.
Yeah.
But for a lot of other people, that's not even an option necessarily, or they want to try, but they're not sure how. How would you go about, if you were starting fresh, helping people figure that out?
The little things are helpful. If you are the type of person that follows the rules so much that if the dentist says you have to be here 15 minutes before your appointment, and you know very well that it's going to be fine if you show up 5 minutes before your appointment or 2 minutes after your appointment, show up right on time. And just note internally that you didn't spontaneously combust when some little thing went outside the line, right? It could be as simple as like, as a term in someone's contract that is horseshit, and you just like, yeah, but I'm not going to bother with this because you're never going to push us on that because it's horseshit, and like that would never anyway. So if you follow the train of events outward and you just think that's not worth it and no one's going to die if we don't touch this, it can be simple things in life, it could be simple things in work, but just like it's the taking one small move and then reflecting, I didn't die. People have this like fight or flight reaction when they change their identity or do something that conflicts with their identity. And if your identity is like, I follow the rules no matter what, without going back to first principles, like you said, then we do have this fight or flight reaction when we break that. So break it in a small way, a way that is obviously like, low to no harm, of course, maybe even net negative harm, which oftentimes the rules work like that. And then just think, the world didn't break apart. My world didn't break apart. I'm the same person. And then you have a new relationship with the rules where you can judge things in terms of rightness and risk. I look at a rule as rightness and risk. First, is it right or wrong? And then is it prudent or not prudent for me to abide by that? Oftentimes, even if you think a rule or something is not well-founded, you can still think, well, it's not prudent for me to break that because all sorts of other bad stuff happens and I don't want that. But I can at least think through what that might be and then choose from there. So I would say if you're not thrust into the situation and you're not forced, like you said, to put food on the table, start small and practice with the little things until you gain confidence that you can be the same person, you can do well at your job, you can do well in life, and you can start to move the goalpost or the kind of the identity signpost of who you are and bump that out a little bit. And you can proactively push that with your actions. You do something and then your identity catches up. It's not the opposite. It's not you decide to be a new person and then you do stuff. You don't say, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, and then you are. You do entrepreneurial things and then your conception of who you are catches up with what you've done. That's how the brain works.
Action, movement dictates so much of everything. And I think helping people understand that they have to take that first step, and then the next step becomes a little bit easier and a little easier, and all of a sudden you're moving forward and you're starting to do things you never thought you might do before is a really important guide tip for everybody listening. I'm also interested in something you said there around relationship with rules. I love how you framed that as rightness and risk, prudent or not prudent. I read this article a few days ago. Somebody, some thought leader somewhere, was writing about autocracy, China versus the United States, and how China is an engineering based society, right? All the people that run China are engineers versus the United States is, for the last basically 50 years, a lawyer based society. Like every congressperson is a lawyer for the most part, right? And how does that impact? And putting all the politics aside and autocracy and all the rest of it, the way you talk about it is actually kind of one of the things I've been thinking through, which is we used to look at something and say, I shouldn't do that because like it's just not right. That's not an okay thing to do. And now people tend to go, is it illegal? Is it something I can get around? And I've wondered in my head over the last few days if all the rules beget more rules, and then you create this like circular vicious system. And how do you get out of that? And I'm just
Yeah.
curious, how did you come up with that framework for yourself? Because I think a lot of people don't think about the world like that.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be put in the situation where when you're an entrepreneur, I mean, honestly, when you're living life in the US, really in any country, you're going to break rules just walking out the door, you know? And especially when you start your own business. And so by the virtue of me doing all the things I needed to do, I needed to like just sometimes out of when you're starting out, you know, from cash flow, you need to stretch some things where it's like, I mean, I actually never did have to modify a payroll date, but I've heard of a lot of entrepreneurs who like, I know this is not legal, but there's no money in the bank account. I must run payroll on this date. And like, what are you going to do? Not run it at all, curl up and die, or send a letter and explain to everyone what has to happen and move that payroll date, right? And it's like, okay, I did what I had to do. And then I accept the risk. And then eventually I've noticed that when you're someone who starts to do, I'm not encouraging moving payroll, manage your cash flow well. That's rule number one. But like, you're going to start bending some things, right? So once you bend some rules that in ways that make sense, you're going to live amongst people who don't. Even as simple as like you start your own business and your friends who have W-2s say, "What are you doing?" Just simple things like that. And then eventually you kind of you stop defending it, you stop coming reasons for it, and then you see where they're coming from. So you stop thinking of yourself as different and weird. You start thinking of them as like, well, you're not happy in your job, and if you get laid off, you have essentially one client, and I have many. So who's taking more risk? You know, and eventually it flips around, and you. I'm not going to pull out like a red pill analogy because that's so co-opted by the wrong people. But there's a moment where you kind of the perspective flips, and then I would like to think I see the world more clearly than when I had a job. And so, whereas even something as simple as like coming up with a name for my business, I got tons of criticism about it at first, right? And I was kind of nervous about that. Well, then I grew the business, and then people started saying, "Well, that's a great name. Oh, it makes so much sense. It's so flexible. Oh, that was genius." And I was like, all I had to do was live in that sort of post-rule world for a bit, where I'm looking at things, like you said, less lawyerly and more engineeringly. Engineers are very rule-based too, but they think of like the more sort of laws of physics type of rule things where, you know, what will happen if this bug is in the software? Is anyone going to actually find it? I mean, obviously not, you know, you don't want to make a bridge that breaks, but like you're thinking about things that are very immutable versus things that, you know, created by man. Anyway, this is all to say that when you live in that world for long enough and you do well at it, everyone catches up with you and they start thinking about, well, what do you know that I don't know? Instead of when you just become this person to start with, you're wondering why you're so crazy to be doing this. And then a few years in, you start making it work and it flips the opposite direction. And everyone thinks, why didn't I not think of that? And they look at you. So I don't know, not 10 years in, a little more than 8 years in, across a number of businesses. And I definitely feel that way. I'm so grateful I made those decisions, those little things along the way that adapted my identity to be somebody who looks at rules in a different way. And I'm very glad I did it. And a lot of people who didn't do it are like my friend who won't pass the bar because she hates her job and is stuck in this paradox of, I need to follow the rules because my mom said I need to be a lawyer and I have all this debt, but I won't just buckle up, pass the bar, get my JD, and then do something else, which is sort of logical, right? But you got to take those little steps, and I'm glad I did. So I think the world catches up with you once you take these little steps. They'll watch. You won't go further from the right path. You will carve the right path. Everyone will wonder why they didn't earlier.
It's really an inspirational way to think about it. And I hope as people listen, they take some stock of where they sit and at least do the minimum of actually look around you and critically think about your life and what you're doing. Because I think that's also something that's seems to be lacking more and more. People just sort of read the headline or they do the basic or they're lazy. They don't take any time to really think through why they're doing anything. That's a societal question that I'm not sure we're going to get into today, but it is something I think a lot about. Something else you said in there is something I want to touch on that I like to touch on with people on my show because I generally have a don't be an asshole rule, don't work with an asshole rule.
Yeah.
And you said something there, which is like, say I can't make payroll, right? There's the version of the world where they just don't say anything or they keep it for themselves or they're making bad decisions or whatever it might be. Or let's not say anything nefarious. They just don't tell anybody, right? You're an asshole. Like there's people relying on you and the rest of it versus, for me, willingness to be transparent, own your own side of your shit, whatever's going on, is actually fundamentally being kind, is being transparent with the people you work with, your wife, your family, whoever it might be. And curious, is that something that you were raised through? How did that come about that you realized it was really important to be kind, to be transparent to others and tell them what was going on and bring them along with the decisions you were making?
Yeah. It feels like the distinction between the reaction between bringing a mess up as a teenager to lawyer dad versus immigrant grandma. And so if you bring a mess up to lawyer dad, it's like, I said, be good. Why didn't you be good? And then immigrant grandma, it's kind of like, you shouldn't have done that, but that's all right. You'll do better next time or something, right? She always says in her thick accent, if be good, but if you can't be good at it. Kind of a little wink. It's like, just that attitude. I realized with all the mess ups that the hiding from it, especially for your team, right? Or for team, customers, investors. I've actually fortunately never had investors, but know a lot of people who did. And whenever you hide, there's this tension that builds up. I can speak as being an investor in other companies too. I was just texting with my CPA last night who was walking me through how we would write off the balance of an investment that became a Ponzi scheme, a very famous one that's in the news now. And I'm thinking too about, how I communicate as an entrepreneur and how the now fraudster that ran this $700 million Ponzi scheme did, and they also didn't communicated wrongly and then hid at the wrong times. And now he's, facing 100 years in prison. Who even lives that long? I hope he lives to 120. But I learned that from, I think, my grandma, and then from experiences after that, when I would bring my actual feelings to the situation and bring transparency. Like, for example, during COVID, my agency lost a third of its clients in a week. We'd actually later gain back more and hit a record in a month and a half from then and do pretty well on top line. But for that first few weeks, we were in this mode of got the team together. So we're going to introduce a new level of financial transparency. Here's this slide deck we're going to run every week. How much cash is in the bank? Here are the different thresholds at which we would have to lay people off. We don't think we're going to have to do that. But if we lose this many more clients, we have to cut pay for everyone. I already cut my own pay. And then if we lose more clients, specifically this many more, then we would have to start laying people off. And here's the order in which we're going to do that. Everyone really appreciated that. I was not happy to have to do that, but it was much better to do that and just to sort of put it all out there, because I think on some level, I know that you can't really be criticized for doing your best in a bad situation. And it used to be, I don't want to be criticized. And now I've just seen the sort of inherent rightness of that behavior, of transparency and leading with, I'm feeling this. Here's what I'm noticing. Here's what we need. And here's what we plan to do in these situations. Do you have any questions? Just initially it was, that's the most defensible thing I can do. And then it became, well, it goes way beyond being, defensible, hard to criticize action. That's just a good way of leadership. And eventually I realized that good leadership is also in itself very, very difficult to criticize because it feels so good to be the recipient of. And so, good leadership with your team, with everyone around you, investors too. I had a different investment where they paused distributions a few days ago. They sent out an email and said, the gas plant nearby that was supplying workers for our RV park did layoffs. Our occupancy we underwrote at 90%. We used to have a waiting list. It's down to 60. And I was like, good to know. I sent an email. I said, what's your break-even occupancy? I got a really good email back. And that felt really good to receive. So the fund manager in that situation demonstrated that leadership that you can display with your team. He displayed it with me as an investor of just saying, I don't like this either. I've got money in the deal myself. We have reserves to write this out for years. Here's our break-even occupancy. Here's what we're going to do. And just heard me. It's the same thing with your team. If you're an entrepreneur and you have employees and one of them's mad at you and you just are able to listen and hear, it's really good. It's going to go a long way. I've noticed that in legal disputes too. Just literally hearing somebody who is threatening you and angry goes a super long way. There's a lot you can buy with non-financial, non-legal actions versus if you stick to the letter of everything and you don't lead very well and just it's kind of a, do your job, accept your responsibilities, you sign that contract, you're going to end up paying a lot more. And I realized as an entrepreneur that you can actually do the right thing and save a lot of money by being an emotionally involved good leader for, again, investors, customers, employees, everyone around you, family, and so forth. So that's the other kind of feeling out of the rule side is earlier we talked about, bending rules. I'm not saying that from a sociopathic point of view. I'm saying that from a very emotionally invested point of view of get your feelings in there, get your person in there, and then live these things. And then you'll be able to kind of feel in your body which things can be bent and which ones shouldn't. But all of this is coming back to being personally invested, being grounded in the scenario, and then interpreting, what is the contract? What does this person need in this scenario? When can I make payroll? Doing the math, right? That all can come second after you get in there, you feel it, and then you do that in that order.
I think empathy is such an underrated skill. And I know, again, some famous people believe that it's, a bug instead of a feature.
Yeah.
But I personally just don't think going through the world pretending everything is sort of transactional towards one end mission makes a lot of sense. And so I think growing your empathy, your ability to interact with people, being transparent, understand their side, but also just talk to them is such an underrated skill. And I think to your point, I've been in the legal industry a long time. I used to do very complex, large litigation, lots of money, everybody fighting. And the number of times that it was just simply solved by asking the simple question, have you talked to the other side, ask them if there's a way around this? No, why would I do that? The contract says this. And you're like, okay, let's make a phone call, right? And
Yeah.
it's ends. It's like, I didn't understand that's what was going on. Let's find a way through this. I think that's something very famous people have said, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and the Rolex, and we're you have these huge companies and they have no contracts. They have no anything. They're just no, I told them I was going to do it and they agree to it and we're going to do it and that's fine.
Yeah.
And it's part of that empathy, that ability to connect and do more than kind of the transactional on the paper. And I think it's a good reminder for everybody that there's more to this world a little bit. Something else you said in there is something I like to talk about on this show is how do you get through hard things? And for a lot of entrepreneurs, COVID was, maybe the most monumental hard thing they've had to deal with.
Yeah.
But there's also hard things along the way. Your company isn't as successful as you want it to be. You have to close it down, or you lose clients, whatever it might be. And I think a lot of people get paralyzed when hard things happen. And one of the things I like to talk about is that it's not like you're just born good at getting through hard things. You have to learn a little bit and be willing to persevere to some extent. But I think it's part of that entrepreneurial mindset, which is hard things are going to happen and you have to figure out a way through it. How take the COVID moment or other moments or your most recent company, which I know you've
Yeah.
transitioned away from. when that hard thing happened, how do you train yourself to remember, like, it's going to be okay. I can move through this. I can get through. How do you do that?
Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned that because I remember the moment in the car. I was in the Whole Foods parking lot bringing some groceries home, and I saw the email preview come in. It just said, like, I saw the subject line from LinkedIn. It was a cease and desist. And so I remember the feeling of, like, I knew what it would contain. I didn't need to read it. I knew, like, okay, like, this is something I thought might happen. I knew what we were going to do if it did happen. My first response was like, I'm just going to write him back in a few hours and tell him we intend to comply. Can we have some more time? Simple as that, you know? But I remember the feeling that the first time this happened many years ago, it was like an uncontrollable fill up of, like, you know, when you're kind of starts at your toes and goes to the top of your head and you just read all through the body, right? And this time that happened, but on a much more, I felt it happen, but then it kind of, like, I was able to start letting some of it go and just sit and breathe. And I actually uttered to myself, I just said, my life is not under threat. And I like to say that in those cases because in our modern society, we often react as if our lives are under threat. And we have the same biological reaction. And if you're a law firm and you're hearing this, you're going to see this and hear it in some of your clients when they get that, like, I'm being chased by a tiger. And you're like, no, you're not. You got a piece of paper in the mail. No, you're not, you know? But it triggers that same thing. And it sounds silly, but just saying, my life is not under threat. It's so easy as a way to diffuse that. Remember that we're just sitting in offices doing stuff. And the worst case scenario is so much better than it used to be. I'm reading a book right now called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And in any part of the world, in Europe, you could be traveling from Holland through a port to England, and you could end up on an auction block with your life in indentured servitude, and you're worried now that you got a piece of paper in the mail, your life is not under threat. How do you diffuse those moments? Breathe, say that phrase. Remember, try to put it all in context, and then give yourself a little grace. This is going to be difficult. You're not going to die, but it is going to be difficult, and you're going to feel some tough feelings. And other people have felt tough feelings before too. And if you're an attorney, I'm not saying you have to teach your clients this, but can you do some of that? Can you find a way to integrate some of this into how you speak to them? Can you find a way to remind them of these things? I think you will have a much better time and you'll get far fewer texts at 10 p.m. with status updates and wondering where things are if you integrate a little bit of this, like, grounding into it. And they'll have much more reasonable requests of you too. It'll be less combative. So that's how I would do it. And if you're helping people who are in this scenario, then those are some things you could pass on. But everything we've talked about comes back to, can you first ground, give yourself grace, be in the moment, be present, and then do the thing, whether it's rules, dealing with hard things, getting a cease and desist, getting a negative ruling, or anything that happens, losing a client, any bad thing that happens. If your life is actually under threat, love it. Go into fight or flight, run, fight, do the thing, but reserve it for that. Reserve that fight or flight reaction for literally fighting or literally fleeing. And if you're not doing those things, try to give yourself some grace, come back to the moment, breathe. My life isn't under threat. This is a piece of paper. We're in a modern society. The worst that happens is, literally, it's that you go to the food bank. There is a bank where they give you food. It's generally not worse than that. Your cease and desist does not mean you won't eat. It does not mean you'll get disemboweled by a tiger. So come back.
I love the tiger analogy. I love the way to think through that because, it's something that I've had to work on is breathing, is working through stuff with, breath work and just pausing. Something I learned with a toddler, raising a toddler, right? Like telling her those things and being like, you know what? I should probably do that too. That's probably helpful for me. And also something in there that you said, which is something I've learned, a reminder to yourself is the person you're asking for help on whatever issue that you believe is cataclysmic or whatever it might be, doesn't always have your best interest at heart in terms of reducing the stress, right?
Yeah.
And in the legal industry specifically, you said like, hey, lawyers, can you maybe tell your clients not to freak out always, right? Lots of great lawyers do. And oftentimes we play the therapist, right? Like, okay, vent for a while. I understand. We're going to get through this. But sometimes it's in their interest to make this the worst thing on earth so they can, bill a lot of hours and have a big case. And as much as, lawyers love to say, well, that's just not how it happens, yeah, I'll call bullshit on that over and over because, like, life is about incentives, and everybody is driven by incentives, and you can justify almost anything you want through that lens. But I just like to remind people, breathe, think through, like, what is actually the worst that's going to happen here? Totally agree with you. If it's like legitimately life-threatening, yeah, fight it, run, whatever it might be. But otherwise, look around you and figure out who you have in your life that is truly there for you as a sounding board to help you get through that thing. And that's how you start getting through hard things. I personally am incredibly lucky to have a wildly smarter than me partner who I have as that. And I think that's another thing in the entrepreneurship thing is I've learned talking to more and more successful entrepreneurs, you need like that crazy partner or brother or sibling or best friend or somebody there. That's what is almost the cheat code of it. And so I think it's a good reminder of how you get through this stuff.
If you want to continue building your entrepreneurial mindset and enjoy our content, we would love for you to subscribe, hit the bell, follow along. You can also find us on our Substack, PossibLaw. Abrazos.
You also said something in there when you said, you know, the first 5,000 years book you were reading. And it's something else I'd like to touch on is learning, and this innate sense that you need to constantly be learning in all kinds of things when you're doing the entrepreneurial thing. And I'm curious for you is how do you go about that learning flywheel? Do you read a lot? Do you listen to podcasts? Do you watch TV? How do you go about that?
Yeah, good question. You mentioned Charlie Munger. I read all the Berkshire shareholder letters back to front on Kindle. Took me a long, long time, but and then I also read Charlie Munger's talks, and he is very different, but he gave a lot of talks to law schools. It's very interesting to see what he says, and he's a lawyer, and obviously didn't do the thing that you're talking about where, you know, there's a negative incentive loop and you freak your clients out, and he chose the total opposite path, and he lived to just shy of 100. His main criticism of traditional legal academic system is that it's so linear and single disciplinary. And so he's a huge fan of bringing in mental models from other disciplines as much as possible. And he goes much further. He says it's a complete failure of the law school that we don't bring in multidisciplinary learning into this process. We're producing lawyers that can only think in one way. And what we need is people who have tons of mental models from psychology and physics, chemistry, from other hard science disciplines and soft science disciplines. And when you can bring those in, you go from just interpreter of the text to business partner. And I've always tried to embody that as much as I can. And so I didn't always read a lot. I do read a lot now. And also just so there's inner work, right? Of like becoming a person who can integrate new information, who can stop and breathe enough to change your mind. There's the actual learning itself of like intaking new information. So my book right now I'm reading has nothing to do with my current business, but it's really just enriching around the edges for thinking about the system that we live in. And I'm being able to look with fresh eyes on how we went from, you know, like a human economy where you couldn't buy day-to-day things with money. That would be ridiculous. These brass tubes, you can't spend them for food. There's no market. You give them to the shaman if you need spiritual services, or you give them to your proposed bride's family for a wedding present. You can't spend that money. And so it casts a lot of doubt on the history of money. And it's just, I don't know how immediately I'm going to relate that back to my business, if ever, but I just enjoy it. So maybe accepting that there's some chaotic, hard to foresee benefits of whatever it is you're learning if you go to what interests you. Because I've always found that it interests me in some way, and it almost always benefits directly. There wasn't a super clear correlation between reading all of the Berkshire Hathaway annual letters, which is, you know, largely about consumer businesses and insurance businesses, but it's also about making mistakes. It's about the value of winners way out compounding the negative of losers. It gave me ideas for how we structure our software holding company in ways that have been great. We wouldn't be running View Export if we hadn't really gone down this direction and hammered out the model that was, I almost hesitate to say inspired by Buffett because it just sounds so pretentious, right? But like, I was very inspired by reading that, and I thought, wow, the way he did that makes so much sense. And it's so different than just, you know, he bought stocks. That's not how he built the business. Largely, it's not about buying stocks. He had one failing company, bought it for super cheap, used an outsized few years worth of cash flow to buy an insurance company. And that insurance company was the fuel for the rest of the business. He was not I mean, he was good at buying stocks, but that wasn't the primary reason why he did so well, why Berkshire did so well. So learn things that you don't always know how it will benefit you or your career, but that you're interested in. And I think that they will. They always have for me. Sometimes TV, but that's more haphazard. TV is really easy to distract you in one direction versus Kindle recommendations, friends' recommendations on books. Find a friend who reads a lot. Start with anyone you like. Read Charlie Munger and see what he recommends. Yeah, start with one author you like and then go to the back of their book or look online of what they recommend and just follow the rabbit hole. Kind of like the tree diagram behind you. You start with one little node and then it branches out and suddenly you're learning. Suddenly you are this multidisciplinary person. Your clients say, oh, feels like you're more than just a lawyer, And great accountants say the same thing. You're so much more than an accountant. I liked to get that same thing when I was a marketing consultant. I was far more than a marketing consultant. Whatever it is that you are mainly doing, learning will help you become far more than that.
I like to sometimes talk about it almost like you're an athlete. Learning is one skill you have to like practice at and work and set aside time almost to do that, but not in a traditional linear, like I have to take this class to do this thing.
Yeah.
It's just literally like almost a data matrix. Take in a whole bunch of different data and you'll be shocked at what your brain connects that helps you in a totally abstract way. And it's similar to you, for me, anytime any client says like, how do you even know that? It's like such a compliment because I'm like, I don't know. I read something, I saw something, I talked to Alex on a podcast and he dinged something in my head. But that means for me that I am taking in the appropriate amounts of information. And I personally know that if I don't do it, I can feel myself kind of like getting off a little bit. And it's because I've stopped that learning flywheel that I think is so important. And especially in this age where, you can chat GPT something and mostly get a right answer and you've stopped critical thinking and you've stopped asking questions. And I think it puts people in a pretty precarious spot. And when the musical chairs stop, they're not going to know what to do. And so it's a good reminder that learning is, I think, really important. And then I think also multidisciplinary experiences is really important, whether you're doing the entrepreneurship thing or not. Something you brought up there earlier also is an interesting concept I've been working through and talking with people is building businesses where you stay close to the customer, stay close to the business, and it brings up an interesting question because your last company, Aware, right? Again, avoid the legal stuff, just at a basic level, right? You were offering something to the customer that as the customer that I think they clearly demanded and wanted, and LinkedIn just doesn't want to do it, mostly because it's incentivized for LinkedIn to not, right? And it made me think of an interesting concept, which is like you can be customer focused, and I think LinkedIn thinks they're customer focused, but you might not always be building what the customer actually wants. And the further you get away from that, I think the more you get into kind of that LinkedIn, it's good for the customer. It might be good for us too, but it's good for the customer, right? And I'm just curious your perspective on how do you stay connected to customer? Again, the larger you get, especially as like a founder and you start building teams and the rest of it, it's difficult, but how have you done that?
Well, with Aware, I sent a connection request on LinkedIn to everyone who signed up for a free trial, which was over 4,000 people. And I tried to avoid pedestaling myself as much as possible. A lot of founders want to put the CEO title on really quick and then sort of really be that. And I think from the image of a CEO that we have, which is sort of away in the boardroom on the jet, we think that the goal is to be away from the customer. Even like which founder glorifies a customer service role or job? Nobody. But then every customer loves to hear from the founder. That's funny. So just, again, being able to sit with your own impression of what the CEO should be, poke and prod at that a little bit, and then ask, is that what we really want? Is that what's going to help the most? And you often find that it doesn't. It is more difficult when you build a team, especially with getting negative feedback from the customer to you. There's a strong incentive for that not to get to you. So you have to be creative about how you are able to get all types of feedback with as little filtration as possible directly to you. I think about I don't think it's apocryphal. I think this is verified where customers and customer service managers at Amazon would be able to send things to Bezos, or he would look in the records and he would just forward it to the exec team with a question mark. And then that meant you had to like dig into that, solve it, and give him a full report. But there's just a question mark. So he had a system where he either was receiving and or was digging into the Amazon records and figuring out, why are certain issues happening. And then he had a system, simple as it may be, question mark in an email, of getting the reason for that. Amazon also has their executives do, I think it's 2 days of customer service a year. So that's an interesting part of the system. Maybe that doesn't work for you exactly, but somehow keep your pulse on it. It's worth it, even if it's something as simple as that. The goal is not to be away from it. The goal is to be in it, which is another theme we've been talking about this whole time. Is like the goal is to be in it, not distance yourself, not to be arm's length, not to be just transactional. But I mean, if Bezos still listens to, or when he was CEO, was plugged into customer complaints, you probably should too. I'm not saying you have to individually connect with every customer on LinkedIn. That's probably too much for some. But if you have big customers, definitely do it. In the SaaS world, Jason Lemkin's always saying, if you can't think of what to do, get on a plane and go visit a customer. And that is really good advice. Go and talk to your customers is probably the advice that people outside of the software startup world need to hear from Silicon Valley is go stay close to those.
I think that's really great advice. I think we have a tendency in the way this system has sort of become one of individual contributors who then become middle managers, who then become executives, that as you go up the ranks, I always say like an individual contributor, just because they got promoted doesn't all of a sudden understand how to manage people, right?
No.
But it's also the inverse of that, which is sometimes you become a middle manager and your whole job is like you're very good at managing people. You have no idea what the customer does or needs. And so that feedback loop is gone. And so now you're managing people, but like, what are you managing them towards, right? And that's where you often get disconnect where, a manager might say, well, why are we doing this? Do something else. And they're like, no, have you talked to the customer? They want this.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important. And it's also something I've been thinking about, which is that with AI right now, right? I mean, my fundamental thesis right now is that regardless of, put aside the AGI and all the crap, whatever about that, it's just simply a tool that helps you, if you have agency, if you're motivated to do stuff, to do more, means we're fundamentally, I think, going to get more individual contributors who are doing stuff that maybe would have been larger teams. And I think something you talked about there, which is a corollary to that, which is it's important to still be in it. And this might be an opportunity to stay in it longer or in a different way. And so I think that's an important piece for people to remember is like, maybe you want to be just on the jet and not there, but like generally you want to be connected to the business. You want to understand how it works and why it works. And I think that's an important thing for people to remember. Something else I know you have talked about in social media and places is that community is really important, both in entrepreneurship and just generally. You need, we talked about having a partner that is really helpful, but you need your own community.
Yeah.
And it's something I've also talked a lot about because we seem to have more ways to connect than ever, and yet have all this societal problems on loneliness and, the stats on young men having basically no friends and all this stuff. And so I've been trying to figure out how to help and talk about community in a way. Because for me, I've been really lucky. I have a large group of friends that I rely on and, whether it's business or just personal stuff, but it helps with everything. And so I wanted to get some of your thoughts on community and how you find community to help you in your job and just personally.
Yeah. It is more difficult than it probably used to be because I sometimes wonder when I'm sending a connection request, I sit and think about that word, a request to connect. And if you say it enough times, it starts to sound weird, and it sounds like you're saying something crazy. Because it has nothing to do with the request to actually connect. It's a small transaction in itself. I also enjoy my friend group in a couple different communities. My wife has a big family. That's been super helpful too. My family's pretty small, but There's nothing like it. One of the parts of my wife's current business is an online community, which is, I've noticed, is unlike a lot of online communities are Slack groups, and this one's like a place to bring both the wins and the challenges, even the ones that are currently going on, and that's been super helpful. And having there's a team around you, there's the friends, and then there's community, and those are all different things. I have built that slowly. I don't have a good technique for building community. I just start with the first things and follow from there. A lot of community has been built from meeting one person and becoming friends for several months, and then meeting a few other people, and suddenly you're part of a community. It's the same thing with networking, right? Like, people want to do networking, and I say, well, who have you really spent time with? Have you had any offline meetings with these folks that you're working with? Are you only posting on social media, or are you also doing some phone calls? I don't mean coffee meetings that are pitch disguise meetings. I mean actual, like, go get coffee and don't talk about work mostly, or do, but like, you know what I mean? Don't use it as a cover for, don't use connection as a cover for commercialism. If you do that often enough, I've noticed that the commercial benefits definitely do follow by paradoxically not focusing on them so much. And so, yeah, I mean, I've probably spent more time in the late 2010s building like the work community, and LinkedIn really did help with that. If I'm being honest, I don't have bitterness toward LinkedIn. They have not really a customer focus, more of a shareholder and stakeholder focus, which is fine. But it's true that the platform, if you use it right, lets you develop friendships and real connections and people you hang out with and people who have your back and people whose back you can have. And that's the key part too, is like, I think a lot of times with our benefit-seeking society, we think a lot about how others can have our backs and not enough about we can have theirs. And if we lead with that, good things happen. I don't mean come up with an offer that you can put in your cold email that sounds like having their back. That's the wrong thing. None of this can or should be taken as encouragement to sound like you're building community when you're really not. So let's say you do that. Let's say you sound like you're building community and it's really a pitch and it works well and you sell a bunch of stuff. You might have a higher revenue that month, but it's not going to feel right. If you really sit with the image of the CEO on the jet and then let it play out for more than a couple seconds, right? Think about what that's like on hour 3 of your private jet flight. Oh, that's actually not that fun, Who's there with you? Okay, well, let's say you built a big business from posting on social media. Who's there with you? When something bad happens to someone in your community, are you getting a call? If you're not, can you offer to be there for people? A good friend I met on LinkedIn that, originally we met because we were both in the similar like professional area. Now we just hang out. We have FaceTime and talk about our pets and help each other. And yes, once in a while, if it makes perfect sense, like I'm happy to make an introduction for her or something, or for any of someone that's in my community, personal and professional. But the thing is, it didn't start there. The relationships that started with transactions, if it never got beyond that, it's not a very strong one. So I would say build community for its own sake. And if you also want wealth and commercial success, those things will follow from a real community. But you actually will be much happier with a community than you would be with wealth. Having built some wealth, I can confirm firsthand, it's just bits in a computer. I mean, literally just adding a comma to a graph is like, it's just a comma on a graph, unless it's accompanied by the other things. Balance sheet is, again, a piece of paper. It's not worth much without the real assets in it. That's what I found, at least from 8 years of entrepreneurship and learning some lessons the hard way.
I'll second that, third that, fourth that. I mean, and that's pretty much what I've learned throughout my life. At the end of the day, I talk about it, just provide value for the sake of value in whatever capacity that might be, professional or personal, and be authentic in who you are. And for the most part, everything will work itself out from a commercial standpoint, right? Maybe you won't become a billionaire, but that's okay. Who the hell cares, right? Like,
Munger did.
Yeah, you're right. And I think at the end of the day, whether it's LinkedIn or any other social media, we're in this echo chamber of like, that's okay or that's not, or you should do this or you shouldn't, or, well, I can't be in that community because it doesn't fit this thing. Instead of just like taking that first step of like, hi, I'm Sal. Who are you?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll get along, maybe we won't, but I get to know you. And that's also why, like, I've tried, because, I have a lot of friends, and my wife makes fun of me about all my text messages, my buddies, you know, and we moved out to the suburbs, and she's like, we need to build community out here now. Like, and I was like, I have enough friends. I have enough things, right? And then I realized, like, no, I mean, like, that's not really true. And what am I doing with myself, right? And when I started being more willing to put myself out there, not shockingly, I was happier. I was more engaged, all those things. And it's just a good thing to remember, which is just that community is not just for you, it's also for them. But if you do it in an authentic way, everybody's happier. Everybody gets a lot out of it. And so it's something I like to talk about.
Yeah.
And I think the way you said it is like, who's there with you is a really cool way to think about that, right? Because I also believe like teams, in my view, are always better than singular people, right? I think doing things with others is such a fun experience, right? Again, building this big business by yourself versus with people and sharing those memories, I think, is really important.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about how you go about finding new things to work on, right? Now you're into a new thing, View Export, and I'm just curious, how did you figure the one or the other? How do you decide on what you're going to work on?
Well, as usual, I didn't. I guess aware kind of, but with the last company, it was just jumped out at me of like, LinkedIn is working, I'm growing a professional services company with this, but like there's so much that's annoying about it. It just jumped off the page of like, oh, if I had a tool that did this, this, and this, it'd make it so much easier. With View Export, we actually acquired it back in May. They didn't know what to do with it, neither did we at first. And we sort of like thought this was really interesting and bought it. And then what I did is I ran the report of everyone who had used the tool, and there was over 100 people who were using it. And it was 90% IT people, and then some law firms. And I was like, oh, what the heck is going on? There's like big companies in there. And then we started seeing some of the feedback, and then we got people writing to us, like CIOs writing to us and saying, hey, I really need this. It's not quite there. And this was like back in kind of May, June. But can we get in a call? I've been trying to solve this for many, many years. I'm just like, yeah, what's up? And so we did. And they said, okay, we're using this for e-discovery. Nothing else really does quite the same thing. Legal is asking me for this. It's just, as you can see, we can't get this. We're just kind of trawling through giant Slack archives, and it's super hard to read. We can't get what we need from Discovery. Your tool is doing that. Can you build more of these enterprise features? And that we had that same call multiple times, and I reran the list of people, and it was always like head of IT and security, CIO, and then a few law firms. And then I was looking at what they were doing with it, and the use case they selected, it was like discovery. I was like, okay, we know what to do with this. And so we just realized that this was a phenomenal e-discovery tool, very, very specific, right? We're not competing with like a relativity because we don't do more than one thing yet. And right now, for the time being, we're just going to do a really, really damn good job at helping people doing e-discovery who use Slack make sense and cut that time to like scope and filter and export what you need exactly from the mess that is Slack much faster. And if you don't use Slack, if you've never tried to handle Slack files in e-discovery, you would be like, I get a lot of people saying, I have no idea what your new product does. I was like, that's fine. Unless you felt the pain, you will have no idea. And once you do, you will go Googling for it and you will find us. And then you will realize how valuable it is. Yeah, it's a very small slice of e-discovery. And I didn't decide to get into the e-discovery space. We realized what people were using it for. And then I started, as we talked about earlier, learning a ton and just like, what are you using it for? Why? How? And then now I was speaking to someone who was the president of a hospital, and he was like, tell me about your new tool. And I was like, all right, so what we're seeing is that people have this, here's the exact workflow, legal comes to this, GC says that, and then you get, IT gets this order, and then they have to come back in this way. And he was like, yeah, that's exactly how that works. Okay. And I was like, yeah, I feel like I've learned this workflow in some level of detail now. I'm not yet an expert, but as we've talked about, I have enough multidisciplinary knowledge to keep soaking up, to the point where my wife is joking. She's like, yeah, in 3 months, you're going to be on a panel of e-discovery stuff talking about how to do it better because you... And I was like, I don't know about 3 months, but I am going to learn fast, and I'm already learning fast. And we did not decide to get into legal tech. We decided that a product we owned could be rebuilt from the ground up, which we had to do. It took months to rebuild it. And then I did the website myself in a few days. But yeah, now we're here. So it's probably a non-traditional background. I feel like if you're used to buying from e-discovery vendors, you might be used to seeing people who had a legal background, somehow raised money from large venture capital firm, built a big product. Now they're all owned by private equity and they're all kind of gobbled up and they're all just sort of, well, there's a few private equity firms that own all the big e-discovery companies, and that's fine. It's wonderful. And we're sitting over here doing, yeah, but that's $100K a year. And if you just need to do this one thing, it's $6K a year with us. So like, do you want to do that? And we're getting 3 customers a week a few months in. It's not 7 a day like it was my last company, but we're 3 months in. Give us time. And until that time, we'll be there. My current problem, I don't even know why my ads aren't running. I actually heard recently that I think I know why, but like even simple things like that, like we're so new and we're already doing so much cool stuff, but I did not decide to do this. We walked into it and here we are, and I'm learning fast and I'm having a great time doing it. So I look forward to learning more about it.
I think, a key thing there, which makes perfect sense with you, which is just something came to you and you were curious. And you're like, oh, this is interesting. And you looked into it a little bit. And then because you've built this skill to learn and be willing to adapt and grow, you saw a potential opportunity, you jumped in, and you'll see kind of where it goes. And I think it's a good reminder for people that it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to make you curious and interested, and then your willingness to dive in and see what happens. And lots of good can come from that. I also brought up a question, just curious, there's a whole world of venture-backed companies, right? Moonshots, everything's going to be $1 billion. And yet there's all this other businesses that you can make really great money at. And, they're not these venture-backed kind of concepts or ideas. And for you as an entrepreneur, how do you decide that's going to require just a crazy amount of capital, and so I'm just not interested, or maybe you're going to raise money? How have you thought about that? Because I know for me, I've mostly, except for very recently, said, the venture-backed ecosystem is just a lot of work for that capital and has incentives that don't always align with kind of what I want to do. But how have you thought about that?
We more come at it from not wanting to have investors first and foremost, especially venture capital investors. And then thinking, well, what will we do with that as the constraint? So it's less so thinking, start with the idea, then fund it. It's more thinking, we don't want that. What ideas suit our desires for how we want to run business? Ideas that, let's say you want to start a CRM. Do you need venture capital? Well, maybe. But maybe you could bootstrap a CRM just for one very specific niche, such that it's so small it wouldn't really be able to be tackled very well by a giant CRM provider. And then once you're at, $1 million of ARR, then you have plenty of capital to fund more engineering. But honestly, the other part of it is just like, right now we're 2 people. I mean, we're 3 with Aware, but we're 2. But how do I say this? We're both really good. We're not like fresh out of college, or we're not just like running around playing ping pong in a Silicon Valley office. I've done that, by the way. I've hired large teams in that Silicon Valley office and built those teams, and it worked well. But there's something to be said for us out engineering 3 competitors at once and going faster, because there's fewer of us and we're good at what we do and we're focused. You can do a huge amount with fewer people and more focus than you can with many more people, layers of bureaucracy, and more team managers. There's a really glorious thing about having a small team. And I mean, with my last company, we really were out engineering teams of tens and multiple competitors. Yeah, I concede we had that, like, we didn't actually have to shut down. We chose to. I knew the alternative would be getting my profile kicked off of LinkedIn, so I didn't. But because of that, like, we were growing the business well with a team a 10th the size of our competitors. And we were far more profitable because we didn't have all that bloat. So I know our model works. And I know a lot of really amazing teams, especially some of the high-profile names in venture-backed companies, they've had tiny teams for what they've been acquired for. You can run companies with revenue per person of 10 million these days. Built with, in Australia, probably does close to 20 million a year at this point, has 2 people. More and more that's going to come up. My co-founder rebuilt an entire product in I mean, weeks. It's good. And we can just go faster from that. So I don't want to have any investors yet. I'm not diametrically opposed to it on some level forever, but we just don't need to. So why? And so we limited the size of our scope and idea to not, everything under the sun related to e-discovery, but just this one thing for now. And when we have tons of cash flow to fund one other thing, great, we'll do that. We might eventually become a larger platform vendor. But maybe not, because I know that this space is very acquisitive. We'll probably get offers long before that, but hey, that's how we would do it if we weren't offered, is just to keep growing based on customer revenue, not based on Alex, want to be a billionaire, I need to raise a venture capital, tell a big story, build a big team, do all this stuff, and then I don't need to disrupt. I just need to build. So that's the way we look at it.
I think constraints are an interesting, productive piece of anything. And while in some capacity, a venture investor, whoever it is, right, is a constraint to some extent. You have to deliver on that investment. It has other ancillary constraints. But if you have no investors, that can be a good constraint as well, because well, I have to get to cash flow, because it's going to pay the bills. That's what's going to do the thing. And it's a forcing mechanism that you don't get always if you've raised $30 million and just riding around in limos and flying on jets, right? I mean, and I know I'm being facetious. Not everybody does that. A lot of people work really hard in venture-backed companies. I just think it's thinking through the why and choosing your constraints is part of the entrepreneurship model, and thinking through why you do things. And I always like to talk to people about it, because again, both sides of maybe not a coin, but two different perspectives. And I think it's an important one to think through when you are trying to decide what you're going to work on. As we close out today, it's been a great conversation, Alex. I know the audience has learned so much, and I can't wait till we talk again at some point. But I like to close out the show by asking you, what would you like the audience to take away from you today? What little nugget or idea they can take home with them and put into action?
Maybe go back to the thing that we talked about almost in the first few minutes. Try something that takes you out of your comfort zone, and whether it's business or personal, recognize that you didn't die, and then surround yourself with people that also do that. And to become a new person, or to grow your business, or both, which often those are both at the same time. Add more people to your circle who are doing the same thing. I'm happy to be one. So if you are of that mindset and you want to go into my circle, let's connect, and I'll try to be that person for you, and you can be that person for me. But if we can all grow together, we'll build cool stuff and create a better world.
I love that actionable advice. It's really simple. Add more people to your circle. Good things will happen. I think it's a great concept for everybody to do on a daily basis. Where can people find you, Alex?
I'm still up on LinkedIn. I am there, and I'm posting less often than I used to, but that's probably still the best place to find me. We have a non-AI written, totally hand-typed newsletter in the works, but I'll wait on that until we have a few more issues up. But we're going to do once a month, good essays. But I'll probably announce that more on my LinkedIn. So come to my LinkedIn, send me a request to connect, and maybe we'll actually connect at some point too.
I love it. Thank you so much for today, and
Thank you.
Can't wait till we do it again.
Likewise. Thanks, Sal.